In this video, I'm going to go over what elements make up a boomer shooter, a history of 3D technologies that made them possible, and some modern boomer shooters that you can check out if you're interested. First of all, this video was inspired by a comment I got on my roguelike first roguelite video, so thank you for that. However, I am unfortunately not crazy familiar with Quake and couldn't define what a Quake-like is, but I have played a couple boomer shooters and can definitely talk about those. If you're here, you've probably played or at least familiar with the term first-person shooter or FPS games. FPS is by nature a description of how the game is played. Your camera is in first person and you are shooting things. This means several different types of formats and games can be built upon the FPS description. Team-based shooters like Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch, role-playing games like BioShock, and tactical shooters like Squad. All of these games share the same genetic code from a few classics: Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake. In the year 1980, the game Battlezone, developed by Atari for arcade cabinets, marked one of the first times a 3D game reached commercial popularity. Battlezone has the player drive a tank through a seemingly 3D terrain, though the game is more accurately described as 2.5D. Battlezone uses isometric projection, where basic 2D shapes are projected into 3D using equal scaling on the X, Y, and Z dimensions, the same way you might have drawn cubes on a piece of paper before. However, isometric projection wouldn't look great head-on since objects appear larger near the bottom and smaller near the top. So, Battlezone angled the objects in the world upwards to simulate the effect of viewing the world at an angle. Battlezone also implements parallax scrolling, something I've implemented myself in 2D games. The background layers move at different speeds. The furthest back layers move the slowest, and the closest layers move the fastest, giving the illusion of depth. Speaking of illusions, by implementing a periscope viewfinder, Battlezone was able to feel more immersive, as if you were actually looking through the viewfinder of a tank, and was able to implement the Pepper's Ghost illusion, where the game was projected onto a transparent screen through a mirror setup to appear like it had true depth. Battlezone is rendered using points connected by lines to make up its graphics, similar to the classic asteroids, saving on processing power by omitting the textures. The distance from the player to the objects is used to make closer objects appear larger, and further away objects appear smaller. Even though the models appeared to be hollow wireframes, they still acted like terrain that could be hidden behind or blown up. As a bonus fact, the US Army contacted Atari and asked them to build a modified version of the game that ended up being called Bradley Trainer for actual Army training purposes. Ed Rotberg, programmer at Atari, did not want to work on it, but was promised he wouldn't have to work for the military ever again, so he, quote, stayed up until 1 a.m. and went back to Atari at 6 a.m. for 3 months until the game was done. Ed is on record saying, "I'm a bit of a pacifist, so I didn't really want to help train people to kill. Plus, if you have a military contract, the government can really impose a lot of restrictions on your company, which I didn't think was healthy for Atari. But management was under the gun to get it done, so I agreed, as long as I was absolved of any future involvement once it was done." Jed Margolin, another lead engineer and composer, is quoted saying, "I felt, and still feel, that I can be against war and still support our troops. When we send our troops into combat, we are not sending them to give their lives for our country. We are sending them so the enemy troops can give their lives for their country." Both quotes are kind of funny to me in hindsight, since Battlezone was one of the sparks that ignited the history of gruesome FPS games. In the next year, 1981, which was the release date in the EU, the first 3D home game, 3D Monster Maze, developed by Malcolm Evans and designed and published by J.K. Gray Software, was released. Malcolm was a microprocessor systems developer and developed on a Zilog Z80 using Intel 8088 machine code language for small applications. When the factory he was working for closed, was gifted a ZX81 from his wife, inspiring him to develop the game. Malcolm was interested in making something playable with his machine and was inspired by a kid's book, not a particular one, maybe just a feeling he carried on, to place a dinosaur, a T-Rex in particular, in the maze with the player. 3D Monster Maze has not only the title of being one of the first home 3D games, but also one of the first 3D survival horror games. Though the graphics weren't truly 3D, the walls were made of pre-rendered characters placed on the screen depending on how far away the player was from the wall, drawn every frame at a whopping 6 frames per second. The advancement in 3D graphics led to a surge in 3D shooters in the early 90s, starting with Wolfenstein 3D, designed by John Romero and developed along with techno wizard John Carmack. The two co-founded id Software and designed their early games like Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake, as I mentioned, popularizing the first-person shooter genre. Before hardware acceleration revolutionized 3D graphics, every frame and every pixel had to be drawn by the CPU. Wolfenstein 3D was one of the first games that featured textures wrapping around 3D objects, and while Monster Maze 3D was a pseudo 3D game where the textures were pre-rendered, Wolfenstein 3D was rendered in real time using a rendering pipeline. Wolfenstein 3D used a technique called ray casting. Ray casting draws the screen one pixel column at a time by firing an imaginary ray from the player's perspective. By shooting the ray out until it hits a wall, the program was able to determine how to draw the wall based on its type and distance. The more advanced version of this is ray tracing, where every pixel is drawn like that instead, while also using calculations based on the light bouncing off of every single surface and reflection. If you're interested, there's a link to Matt Godbold's video in the description, who explains the math used a hell of a lot better than I can at the moment. There are some limitations with the ray casting alone though. The floor needed to be a flat plane. The map was also limited to grid tiles, so a lot of the maps started to look the same, mostly being square rectangular mazes, but it made it a hell of a lot easier to render. The processing time was also restricted by the output dimension. Since every pixel column was drawn, it might run well on a 360p system, but it would take significantly more effort for a 1080p system. Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake were also released as shareware, software that was encouraged to be copied and shared with others, either with a suggested contribution of a few dollars, or as a trial or first chapter in a game that could later be purchased on discs by sending money to the developer. That was kind of the original free-to-play or demo model, but eventually got eclipsed by freeware and open source. In 1993, id Software released Doom. Doom has a very light narrative. Basically, all the player knows is that they are on Mars, the place is infested with demons, and it's time to gun them down. Development started when John Carmack started working on the Doom engine while the rest of the team was finishing up the prequel to Wolf 3D, Spear of Destiny. The Doom engine, also known as the id Tech 1 engine, rendered the world using vertices. Vertices, basically points in the world, make up lines, lines make up sides, and sides are grouped into sectors. These sectors contain data like the floor elevation, wall height, ceiling height, light level, and textures. This means that different areas in the world could have different elevations, leading to stairs in higher and lower sections of the map. However, since the map was still 2D and only projected into 3D, floors above other floors, like multiple floors in a building, cannot be implemented yet. Doom uses a system called binary space partitioning to generate BSP data for a level before being played. The level is geometrically divided into subregions and placed into a tree, where each node in the tree represents a different area. Basically, the map is chopped up until you have a bunch of simple non-overlapping regions. This is done so that the game knows which areas are in front or behind other areas. There exists a few algorithms, such as the painter's algorithm, to render 3D spaces. However, it is very inefficient since it draws all of the objects in the level back to front. So if there were 10 objects in front of the player, they would be drawn from the furthest to the closest, even though most of them would be covered up by another, closer object. All of this extra rendering and calculating was incredibly taxing on the CPU, slowing down the program. Raycasting doesn't have the same issue since the rays come out from the player and scan from left to right, but a beam must be fired for every pixel on the X dimension, making it very inefficient at higher dimensions. Binary space partitioning, on the other hand, lets the game be drawn like the painter's algorithm but in reverse, rendering from front to back. Since the BSP graph knows where the player is by doing a binary search and looking for the node they're in, the BSP graph can give the game spatial data about the objects that are closest by going up the tree. Now the game can draw the closest walls and objects, going from closest to furthest, until the entire screen is drawn. Even though the player theoretically could look up or down, this rendering technique made the walls look kind of goofy, not properly shifting for the perspective, and would take much more computational power to look right. Since Doom was heavily optimized to run on older hardware, restricting the player from vertical camera movement was one of the concessions made. Enemies' hurt boxes extended down the Z direction, they were basically considered on the same elevation as the player since the game is in 2D, so they could still be shot at and killed even though the player wasn't aiming vertically at them, with the player's bullets flying up to meet them. This leads us to one of the greatest leaps in 3D game engine technologies. In 1996, id released Quake. I am gonna be real with you, I know even less about the narrative of Quake. Wolfenstein is easy to get, Doom I can accept your space marine sent off to kill demons, but Quake? You go to an alternate dimension to find and kill an enemy called Quake. Like Wolf 3D and Doom, Quake was controversial for the level of graphic violence on release. To facilitate the release of Quake, id Software, it's mostly John Carmack again, developed the Quake engine, also known as the id Tech 1.5 or 2 engine, depending on who you ask. The Quake engine featured true 3D rendering, though it wasn't true 3D until the release of the id Tech 2 or 2.5 engine with Quake 2. The Quake engine used a 3D coordinate system and used true 3D projection to let the player look and aim up and down, unlike Doom, which used that projection trick to fake wall elevation. The engine wasn't considered true 3D yet since the lighting was baked, as it was computed beforehand and applied to the textures, and collision detection was still mostly 2D. Fun fact, in 1999, id released the source code for the Quake engine under the GPL 2.0 license, which Valve forked, which means they made a copy of it to independently modify, which ended up being the Gold Source engine. Gold Source was used to make Half-Life, and later, the Source engine. It's way too big to go over, but check out the full Quake engine family tree. It extends down even into Dota 2, Deadlock, Counter-Strike 2, Apex Legends, and Black Ops 6. It's kinda crazy. Quake implemented potential visibility sets, or PVS, to help with rendering. PVS is a type of occlusion culling, which is used in games to help determine what should be rendered and what can be omitted since it's out of the player's sight. From my understanding, the map starts by breaking down its geometry using the BSP tree described earlier, except this time the entire 3D space is broken down into leaves. The connected areas of the 3D spaces, basically the entrances and exits to rooms, are called portals. A pre-constructed graph of these portals is used to help determine which rooms in the game should be rendered at any given point. Think of it like you're in a room with a closed door. The only thing the game needs to worry about showing you is the walls and objects in the room. However, if the door opens, then it needs to render the space outside of your room, for example, a hallway. If that hallway leads to another room with a closed door, it only needs to load your room in the hallway. But if that door is also open, then the game needs to render your room, the hallway, and the next room, since you would be able to see into all three from certain points. That's all well, but what if the hallway was at an angle? You might not be able to see the next room from every point in your current room, so how do we determine if that next, or any other room for that matter, should be loaded at any point? You could shoot a ray from the player's perspective from every angle behind the portal to see if they intersect the next portal, meaning that next room needs to be rendered, but that's computationally very expensive, which is what we're trying to avoid. Instead of shooting rays, the id Tech engine uses a volume made of separating planes to determine if that next portal, and therefore node, is visible. This volume contains all the sight lines that pass through the portal. If the portal is fully outside of the volume, as in it isn't within or intersecting with the separating planes, then it can be omitted from rendering. Then of course, if you enter the next node, the same calculations are performed to determine which nodes should be viewable from where the player currently is. At its core, it's a calculation that determines which rooms should be visible to the player, and doesn't render the rooms that aren't. This allowed for incredibly large maps without worrying about overdraw, since only a few nodes would be rendered at once. The concept itself is fairly straightforward when you consider it like that, but all of these techniques were mind-blowing to me when I first started researching them. There were other 3D games or other games with 3D rendering before Quake, like Battlezone in 1980 and Jumping Flash in 1995, but Quake and the id Tech game engine were possibly the most performant 3D game and engine at the time, resulting in the FPS boom of the 90s, and that leads us to... what makes a boomer shooter? Boomer shooters are games with elements from those id Software games I described in the previous chapter. Like roguelikes, there's not a strict definition, but they generally have these traits. Fast movement speed and air strafing, where the goal is to dodge incoming projectiles instead of tactically hiding in a cover from them. This can also include movement mechanics like bunny hopping, a technique used to preserve momentum to increase speed by jumping as soon as the player hits the ground. The player is more durable and can take a few hits compared to many modern games where 1 to 3 bullets is enough to take them out. The enemy's range is also generally much shorter. It uses projectiles, or enemies try to get within melee distance, whereas in modern games, ranged weapons encourage a slower, more tactical playstyle. The player has access to their entire arsenal, usually bound to keys on a keyboard or to a wheel that they can choose from at any point, to strategically swap to kill certain enemies or to adapt to new environments. Guns generally aren't reloaded as well. The limiting factor is ammo found in the world or by killing enemies. Item pickups are found on the map for players to sustain themselves, and usually secret areas with extra power-ups or Easter eggs are scattered across the map. Weapons or other utility upgrades are also found exclusively on the map. Non-linear level design, which usually involves looping back around on a different floor. For example, the player might need to collect keys and double back to open a door to a new area. More emphasis on action than story or narrative. Less focused on elements also include old-style graphics where the enemies are either billboards or low poly, not needing to clear the entire floor before progressing, generous ammo to the point where it's not tactical, and good hipfire accuracy instead of being penalized, especially while moving like in some games. Running around and hipfiring is also one of my favorite ways to play a lot of these games and other modern games like Payday 2. Finally, more fantastical enemies like aliens, demons, zombies, eldritch cultists, and the like. A lot of the gray zone comes from that modern games have modern rendering techniques, usually vary a lot in these categories, and some of them could be lumped under the umbrella of arena shooter, where the player or players are engaged in fast-paced, close-quarters combat, or Doom clones, which were games directly inspired by Doom. Something all Doom clones are boomer shooters, but not all boomer shooters are Doom clones. But boomer shooters usually have very many of the traits I mentioned above. Now, where did the name come from? It beats me, since they were developed by an old Gen X for young Gen X and millennials. But a popular theory, and the one I prescribe to, is a meme poking fun of that generation of millennials talking about modern shooter games, saying things like Quake 3 is better than X game, and yep, Doom was a good game, sounding like boomers talking about how things were better and more simple in their day. It also sounds catchier than AFPS or Doom clone or retro FPS, since games have come far from Doom and don't all exactly resemble the gameplay of Doom. Boomer Shooter actually got its own tag on Steam a bit more than a year ago, but it's more than likely a user-generated tag that was added to enough games to become a recognized tag. Like I said, I haven't played too many boomer shooters before doing research for this video, but I have played a couple remakes / remasters in games which try to emulate the classic boomer shooter style. Of note is that I wouldn't call the Wolfenstein remakes boomer shooters, but I want to talk about them anyway. The modern boomer shooters I have played include Doom 2016, Doom Eternal, Wolfenstein, The New Order, The Old Blood, The New Colossus, and Young Blood. Yeesh. Forgive Me Father, Immortal Redneck, Dusk, and A Medieval. The modern Doom games. God, I love the modern Doom games. Praise it, Bethesda can actually publish some good modern games. The new Doom games, despite their contemporary looks, feels much more like boomer shooters than the modern Wolfenstein games I'll talk about in a minute. Modern Doom encourages fast-paced combat by having many enemies swarm the player while dropping pickups on the ground. Ammo, fuel, health, everything you need to continue the rampage. Since your survival is dependent on your speed and aggression, this encourages a significantly faster gameplay speed, which is indicative of the old-school boomer shooter formula. The map also features non-linear layouts with secrets placed throughout, which leads to a lot of fun discoveries. They do, however, feature some of the things not typical of modern boomer shooters. Weapon upgrades with paths leading to a more RPG feel, and arena-style segments which necessitate clearing the area to progress. Despite these, however, they are very close to the classic boomer shooter formula, and are fun as hell. I, for one, enjoyed the modern Wolfenstein games, and while some of the boomer shooter elements still lurk within it, I can't recognize the modern Wolfenstein games as boomer shooters. Wolfenstein still features things like a weapon wheel and exploration of find secrets, while finding all the powers and guns you need while on the map, but the modern gameplay feels a lot slower and more methodical. This is especially the case when the game implemented commanders, units which can call in other enemies and encourages the player to take them out first before being seen or noticed. This is due to the player's relatively lower health pool being able to be taken down by distant hit-scan enemies, which is greatly felt on the higher difficulty settings. Since it's advantageous to take out this commander first, the game encourages a stealthier approach before either going in guns blazing or silently picking off the rest of the map. The new Wolfensteins are also especially cutscene and narrative heavy, with an emphasis on BJ Blazkowicz and his Herculean task of stopping the New Order, while also weighing the value of his life as a new father. So all in all, the modern Wolfenstein games might look like boomer shooters from the surface, since they're reimaginings of a classic, but hardly boomer shooters. Forgive Me Father, I played the first game to completion, but I'm waiting for the second to come out of early access to try it. Although I have some small criticisms and nitpicks of the game, it definitely has the elements of a boomer shooter. Fast-paced farming combat with minimum cover, pickups on the ground and in the world, secret areas, a fantastical cast of enemies, and the player is pretty durable and able to cause some serious carnage with their abilities. However, I found the game to be a bit more style over substance. The stylized art and animations are fantastic, especially the guns, but it gets repetitive towards the end. The game also has a little bit of story and lore in it, but that requires the player to slow down and interact with items in the world to read bits of the story. Overall, it definitely feels like a boomer shooter, but is lacking in some areas, which I'll probably go over more when I cover the game. Immortal Redneck I've played a bit, but want to check out more in the future since it has Twitch integrations, allowing streamers' viewers to interact with the game. But from what I have played, it's been pretty fun and definitely features a lot of the classic boomer shooter elements. Hip firing, blazing fast speed where you're better off dodging than taking cover, carnage, all while being a roguelite. If you don't know what a roguelite is, check out this video. It's definitely got the look and feel of the boomer shooter, but the slow meta progression, procedural generation, reloading, and random upgrades definitely make it feel more like a roguelite than a classic boomer shooter experience. Immortal Redneck is, however, a great fit for fans like myself that can enjoy both aspects. These next two games I hadn't played before, but decided to briefly check them out to make this video since they're already in my library from a bundle or something. Dusk and a Medieval. Dusk definitely earns a place here. It looks and feels like a 90s shooter with a fast pace and bunny hopping to keep momentum. The game starts you off in a tight corridor with only your melee weapons, a pair of sickles, and immediately you realize how important movement and kiting the enemies will be, a lesson that persists throughout the game. The story is paper thin too. You wake up, things have gone bad, better kill everyone. The pistols do feature aim down sights, but the main point of the game is to move fast and kill things, not tactical or slow. Of note is that if you die during a level, you're sent back to the start, no save points, which caught me off guard since the first time I was playing against the first boss, I was trying to save my best gun's ammo by firing into it with my pistol, only to get obliterated halfway through. A Medieval also fits nicely into the boomer shooter definition. It's also fast-paced, has item pickups around the world, secrets, your character is very durable, you are swarmed with enemy waves, and chaos ensues. Unlike Dusk, the weapons in a Medieval are much more fantastical. A magic staff, a sword that shoots cleaving waves, a lightning trident, and a grenade launcher that shoots mini explosive planets. There's no fall damage and you can move underwater fine, so the map encourages fast-paced exploration. Unlike Dusk, there are small save points which helps if you do mess up, like I somehow managed to drop between two waves of enemies at once and got swarmed. Enemies also sometimes drop bits of soul, which charges up a power-up when activated massively boosts your fire rate and damage. I'll be playing more Immortal Redneck, Dusk, and a Medieval. Maybe Dusk and a Medieval first, since I can appreciate a game with a definitive campaign, no need to grind for hours or days. That's not a slight against roguelites, it's just nice to have a change of pace sometimes, since most games I play these days are roguelites. I'm planning on picking up Ultra Kill when it's finished too, so let me know if there's any other boomer shooters I should check out. I find my most enjoyment with boomer shooters in the really tense moments when you're low on health but manage to keep going on the few resources spewing out of enemies, which is probably why the modern Doom games are my favorite out of the bunch. Mindlessly racking up combos can be fantastic too. So Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake laid out the groundwork for the 90s FPS boom, which still inspires modern games I'm playing to this day, like Forgive Me Father, whose review you can check out by pressing the link on the screen when it's out. Thanks, I'll see you next time.